The stagecoach door swung open, and Eliza Crane stepped down into a town that was not expecting her. She knew it the way you know a held breath. Nobody moved to take her trunk. The driver set it in the mud beside her boots and tipped his hat and climbed back up before she could ask him to wait. She had a letter folded in her glove. She had read it so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. It told her a man named Samuel Reed would be standing by the freight office in a grey coat, and that he would be holding his hat against his chest so she would know him. There was a freight office. There was no grey coat. There was no man holding his hat. A woman in an apron crossed the street toward her, slow, the way people walk when they are carrying news they would rather not deliver. "You're her," the woman said. It was not a question. "You're the one Sam sent for." Eliza said yes. She said it with the small bright smile she had practiced on the train, the one meant to tell a stranger that she was reasonable and capable and would be no trouble to anyone. The woman did not return it. She looked at the trunk in the mud, and then at Eliza's face, and something in her own face folded. "Honey," she said, "Sam Reed was buried Tuesday." The street kept moving around them. A wagon rolled past. A dog barked twice and gave up. Eliza stood very still and felt the whole shape of her life tilt, like a picture knocked crooked on a wall, the kind you keep meaning to straighten and never do. 3 weeks she had traveled. She had sold her mother's sewing machine to buy the ticket. She had told the only 2 people who would miss her that she was going west to be married, and she had believed it, every mile of the way. Now the man she was to marry was a name on a stone she had not yet seen, and she was standing in a strange town with everything she owned at her feet and not enough money to go home. Margaret Dunn took the trunk handle on one side and nodded at Eliza to take the other. They carried it between them down the street because nobody else would, and Eliza was grateful for the weight of it, for a thing to do with her hands while the news kept arriving in waves she had not braced for. A stone she had not seen, a grave she had no right to grieve at and could not stay away from, a whole imagined life going out like a lamp in a draught. She had pictured 100 kinds of arrival on that train. He would be shorter than she hoped, or graver, or already half a stranger in the flesh that the letters had not warned her of. She had pictured awkwardness and silence and the slow work of 2 strangers learning each other. She had not once in 3 weeks of pictured this. You can prepare for disappointment. You cannot prepare for an absence, shaped exactly like the future you sold a sewing machine to reach. A man 2 doors down stepped out onto his porch, looked at the 2 women carrying a trunk through the mud, and stepped back inside. That was the town's whole greeting. Eliza would learn later that it was not unkindness, exactly, but a frontier carefulness about other people's sorrows, a sense that grief was a private animal, best not crowded. At the moment it felt like the loneliest thing she had ever seen, a porch emptying at the sight of her, as if her bad luck were a weather that might blow onto anyone who watched it too long. To understand how a sensible woman ends up at the wrong end of the country with a dead stranger's name in her glove, you have to go back to the winter before, to a boarding house in Ohio where Eliza Crane mended other people's clothes by lamplight and watched her own years go quiet. She was 26. In the arithmetic of that town, 26 was a sum that had already been added up and put away. Her mother had passed in the spring. Her father had been gone longer than she could clearly remember. There was a cousin who let her keep the back room in exchange for the mending, and the cousin was kind in the way of people who are kind because it costs them little. The advertisement was in a paper a boarder had left behind. Reed, S., of the Montana Territory. A widower with a small cattle concern, and, the notice said plainly, no talent for letters and less for loneliness. He was seeking a wife of steady temper who did not mind the quiet. Eliza had read it 3 times before she understood that her heart was beating faster. She wrote to him that night. She was honest. She told him she could cook plain food well and fancy food badly, that she could sew anything, that she had a temper she kept on a short rein and a habit of reading aloud to herself when she was alone. She did not tell him she was lonely. She thought he would hear it anyway. His reply came 6 weeks later. The hand was rough and the spelling was a man's best guessing. and it was the kindest letter she had ever received. He said he had read her letter to his horse because there was no one else to read it to, and the horse had seemed to approve. He said the quiet out here was wide enough for 2 people and still leave room. He said come, so she came. On the train she let herself imagine him. Not handsome, she told herself, do not be a fool, but kind. A man who read letters to his horse. A man who said the quiet had room. She imagined a small house with a window facing east, and herself at that window in the morning, and the shape of a life that was finally, fully her own. The woman in the apron, whose name was Margaret Dunn, and who kept the boarding house at the edge of town, told her most of the rest as they walked. Sam Reed had taken a fever in the lungs. It had come fast, the way it does in cold country. He had asked Margaret, near the end, whether the lady from Ohio had been written to and told not to come. Margaret had not had the heart to tell him there had been no time. He died believing Eliza had been spared the trip. The cousin in Ohio had not been cruel about it, which was somehow worse. She had simply been relieved. One less mouth, one less reason to feel guilty about the back room. Well, the cousin had said, I hope he's good to you, in the tone of a woman closing a ledger. Eliza had walked to the train with one bag, and her mother's wedding ring sewn into the hem of her coat, the one thing she had not sold, and she had felt, God help her, free. Sam Reed's letters had been the first time in her adult life that someone wanted to know her opinion on a thing and waited for the answer. He asked her what she thought of a name for a heifer. He asked whether she preferred mornings or evenings, and then told her he was an evening man and hoped that would not be a trouble between them. Small questions. Nobody had asked her small questions in years. The small questions were how she knew it was real, or would have been. Margaret Dunn had a spare room and a soft spot, and not much else, and she gave Eliza both. You'll stay here till we sort you, she said, in a tone that did not invite argument. Eliza, who had been braced to sleep in a church doorway, did not argue. That first night she lay awake under a borrowed quilt and listened to a town she did not know. Somewhere a piano played badly and stopped. The wind found a loose board and worried it. She thought she would weep and found she could not. Grief needs a face to fasten to, and she had never seen his. In the morning there was a knock, and it was not Margaret. A man stood on the step with his hat already in his hands, which made Eliza's breath catch for the cruelty of the echo. He was tall and weather-cut, perhaps 30, with a quietness about him that seemed less like shyness than like a thing he had learned on purpose. Ma'am, he said, my name is Caleb Reed. Sam was my brother. He had ridden in from the Reed place at first light, he told her, the moment word reached him that the lady had come anyway. He had not known what he would say. He found he still did not. He stood turning his hat in his hands and looking at the porch boards as if they might offer him the words. I'm sorry, he said finally, for all of it. He wanted you to have a good life. He talked about it like it was already done. Eliza found her voice. Then you knew that he'd sent for me. I read him your letters, Caleb said. He couldn't. Well, he could read some, not the small writing. I read him every one twice. He looked up then, and there was something raw in it. He laughed at the part about the horse. So this was the brother who had been the voice of the man she fell halfway in love with on paper. The letters in Sam's rough hand had been written by Sam, she understood now, but spoken first by Caleb, read aloud and discussed and sent. She did not know what to do with that. Neither, it was plain, did he. Caleb stayed for coffee because Margaret put it in front of him, and he was not a man who knew how to refuse a kindness once it was poured. He sat with his hat on his knee and his hands around the cup and answered Eliza's questions about his brother in short, true sentences that she had to draw out one at a time, and each one was a small gift, a piece of the man she had almost married, handed across a kitchen table by the man who had spoken his words for him. Sam had been the older brother and the talker of the two, Caleb said, which surprised her, because she had imagined the letter writer as the quiet one. No, Sam talked enough for the whole county. Sam could not write his own name without sweating, but he could make a room laugh, And Caleb had been the one who could put words on paper, so the letters had been a thing they did together, Sam pacing and talking, and Caleb writing it down and reading it back, the two of them arguing over whether a sentence sounded too forward or not forward enough. "He'd have liked you in person," Caleb said. He was sure of it. He was sure of most things. Chapter 4. The Slow Thaw. There was the matter of what came next, and the country did not pause to let anyone decide it gently. Eliza had no money for a ticket east, and no particular reason to want one. Caleb had a cattle operation that his brother had half-owned, and a winter coming that would not be kind to a man working it alone. Margaret Dunn, who saw the shape of things before either of them would say it, made the suggestion plainly over a pot of coffee. The Reed place needed a hand who could keep a house, and cook, and mind the books, for Sam had kept the books, and Sam was gone. Eliza needed work and a roof. There was a second room in the farmhouse. It was nobody's business but theirs, and the town could keep its opinions in its pockets. "It isn't," Caleb started, and stopped. "I wouldn't want you to think I expected anything. You came here to marry my brother. I'm not him." "No," Eliza agreed. "You're not." And then, because she was tired of being handled like spun glass, "I can keep your books, and I can cook your supper, and I will sleep behind my own door. If that suits you, it suits me." I did not come all this way to go back with nothing. It suited him. They shook on it like two people closing a deal at a fence line, and that was the whole of the ceremony that bound her life to the Reed place. The work was hard, and it was good for her. She had not known how much she needed something that asked for her whole body and not just her hands. She learned the cattle by their faces, which Caleb said was a foolish way to know them, and which he did too. She found Sam's books in a careful, unschooled hand, and put them in order, and found pressed into the back of the ledger a sprig of dried prairie sage, and under it, in Sam's spelling, the words for when she comes. She did not show Caleb that. She pressed the sage back into the ledger, and closed it, and sat for a while in the cold front room of a house built by a man she never met, who had been planning where to put her. The thaw between her and Caleb was made of small things. He learned she read aloud when she thought she was alone, and he started leaving the door between the rooms cracked at night, so the sound of it reached him, and never said so. She learned he could not abide a quiet supper, and could not start a conversation to save his life, so she started them, every night, and watched him come slowly toward her words like a man warming his hands. The farmhouse, when she first saw it, undid her a little. It was small and square and built with care, and the east window was exactly where she had imagined an east window, and she understood standing in the cold front room that Sam had built the house around the woman he was planning to bring to it. There was a shelf at a height for someone shorter than either brother. There was a hook by the door that no man would have placed so low. He had been building for her, a stranger, on faith, and he had died with the house finished and the bride 3 weeks out. She and Caleb worked out the rules of the thing without ever quite stating them. She took the small room. He took Sam's old room and left his brother's things where they were for a long while, unable to box them up, and Eliza did not offer to do it for him, because some grief has to be done by the hands it belongs to. They ate together and worked the place together and slept behind separate doors, and the town talked for exactly as long as it took to notice that nothing improper was occurring, and then it found something else to talk about, the way towns do. What she had not expected was how much she would come to love the work itself. The mending in Ohio had been small and endless and thankless. This was large and seasonal, and it answered back. A fence mended, stayed mended. A calf pulled live in a cold dawn was a life that had not existed and now did, steaming in the straw, and the plain fact of having helped it into the world sat in her chest all day like a banked coal. She had spent 26 years being useful to people who barely noticed. Here the country itself noticed, and paid her in the only currency she had ever really wanted, which was the sense that her hands mattered. On the 4th evening, she found Sam's reading primer in a drawer, a child's book worn soft, and understood that the older brother had been teaching himself his letters, late, in secret, so that one day he could read his own wife's words without his brother's help. He had not finished. He had died, with the small writing still beyond him. Eliza sat with that primer a long while, and then she did not tell Caleb about it either, because some things a person earns the right to keep, and the picture of a grown man bent over a child's book by lamplight, learning his letters for love, was hers to carry now, the last gift of a man she never met. Winter came the way Sam's letter had promised, wide and white and serious. In the second week of it, a storm closed over the valley and did not lift for 4 days. On the third day, a steer broke through ice at the low creek, and Caleb went out after it against every grain of sense, because losing stock in a hard winter was the difference between spring and ruin. He did not come back when the light went. Eliza stood at the east window, the one she had imagined herself standing at in a different life, and watched the dark fill up with snow and no shape of a man in it. She did the only thing there was to do. She lit the lantern Sam had left by the door, the big one with the wide throw, and she hung it in the window so its light reached as far into the storm as light could go. Then she put on every warm thing in the house, and she went out into it, following the fence line by feel, calling his name into a wind that took the sound and scattered it. She found him a 1/4 mile down the creek, on his knees in the snow, with the steer hauled half out of the ice and his hands gone past feeling. She got under his arm, and she got him up. They came back along the fence with the lantern in the window pulling them home like a low star, and she talked the whole way about nothing, about Ohio, about the foolishness of men who knew cattle by their faces, because she had read once that you keep a freezing man talking, and she was not going to lose the second Reed brother to that creek. Inside, by the stove, with his hands in a basin of water just off cold, and his color coming back, Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You came out in that," he said, "for a steer." "For the steer," she agreed. He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen him do it without first deciding to. "Liar," he said, soft, and she let him have it. She learned the shape of his quiet over those first weeks, and learned that it was not emptiness. He was thinking, always, behind that still face, and once she stopped expecting chatter, she began to hear the other things he said, in the way he set a second plate without being asked, in the way he started leaving the good lantern by her door because she read late, in the way he took the heavier end of every load without comment. A talker tells you he cares. Caleb Reed showed you and hoped you were paying attention. She started the supper time talking on purpose, as a project, the way you might gentle a skittish horse. The first night she got 3 words, the second night a full sentence. By the second week she could get a story out of him if she was patient, about his and Sam's boyhood, about the winter the river froze so hard they drove a wagon across it, about their mother who had died when Caleb was 9 and Sam 12, and how Sam had more or less raised him from there, which explained, she thought, the particular hollow that Sam's death had left, a hollow shaped like a father. And she told him her own things, because talk is a trade and not a gift. She told him about the boarding house and the mending and the years gone quiet. She told him about her mother's sewing machine and selling it for the ticket, and how she did not regret it even now, even with the grave on the hill, because the woman who had boarded that train had been more alive in 3 weeks of foolish hope than in the 6 years before it. Caleb listened to that the way she had learned he listened, fully, without rushing to fix it, and at the end he said, "Then it wasn't for nothing, the machine," and she found she had to look out the window for a moment. The storm broke on the 5th day, and the world came back blinding and new. With it came the question that the winter had let them set aside. A letter arrived for Eliza, forwarded twice, from the cousin in Ohio. The back room was open again. There was mending to be done. She could come home. She read it at the kitchen table, and Caleb watched her read it, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then he got up and put on his coat, and said he had things to see to, which was the thing he said when he did not have words, and he went out to a barn that did not need seeing to. Eliza found him there an hour later, doing nothing useful, just standing with his hand on a stall rail. "I can go," she said. "There's a place for me there. You don't owe me a thing past my wages." "I know that," he said. Then say something, she said. Because I am tired of being the only one in this house who starts the talking, Caleb Reed, and I would like, just once, for you to tell me a true thing without me dragging it out of you by the boot. He turned around. Whatever he had learned about keeping quiet, he set it down. My brother sent for a wife, he said, and God help me. I read him every word you wrote, and somewhere in the reading I went and fell for the woman on the page, and there is no decent name for that, so I never said it. Then you got off that coach and you were real, and I have spent every day since trying not to want the one thing in the world I have got no right to. The barn was very quiet. A horse shifted. Outside, the melt was coming off the eaves in a steady bright drip. Well, Eliza said, when she could. That's a start. The lantern in the window was Sam's habit, she learned later. He had hung it on bad nights so any soul lost on the trail would have a star to steer by, and Caleb had kept the habit without quite knowing why, and now Eliza had used it to pull a freezing man home, and the three of them were tangled together in that one small light, the dead brother and the living one, and the woman who had come for the first and stayed for the second. She did not say any of that to Caleb by the stove, but she thought it, watching the color come back into his ruined hands, and she understood that the house had quietly become hers in the only way that counted, which is that she had begun to fight for the people in it. He shook for a long time after the cold let go of him, the deep shaking that comes when the body finally believes it is safe enough to be afraid. Eliza sat with him through it. She did not fuss, and she did not leave. She put another blanket over his shoulders, and she kept talking, low, about nothing, the way she had on the trail, until the shaking eased and his breathing went long and even, and he slept sitting up by the stove, like a man who had set down a weight he had been carrying alone for 3 winters. She stayed awake and watched the fire, and thought about the words she had not let herself think on the trail, when she was hauling him back along the fence, and her own hands were going numb. She had not been thinking of him as her employer out there. She had not been thinking of him as Sam's brother. She had been thinking, with her whole body, do not take this one too. And she had not stopped to ask the country who exactly she was bargaining with, or what she was admitting by the asking. They did not marry that week, or the next. It seemed to them both that a thing built this strangely deserved to be built slow and on purpose, so that no one could ever say it was only the winter or only the need. Caleb courted her properly, badly, with the same hopeless earnestness he brought to conversation, and she let him and corrected him and came to love the trying more than she would have loved any smoothness. In the spring she planted the prairie sage from the back of Sam's ledger by the east window, and it took and came up grey-green and stubborn the way that country grows the things it means to keep. She told Caleb where it had come from and what Sam had written under it, and he was quiet a while, and then he said his brother had always had better sense than him about what mattered, and she said she would not go that far, and he laughed, on purpose and then not. They were married under the cottonwood at the low end of the creek, near the water that had nearly taken him, with Margaret Dunn standing up for the bride, and the whole small town having decided, after all, to keep its opinions to itself, and bring pie instead. There is a thing the writer Hamlin Garland once said about that country, that it was a land where, in his words, the wind comes down from the wild lands with a smell of mown hay and ripening corn. And Eliza thought of it often, standing at the east window in the mornings, in the life that had been planned for her by one man and lived out with another, the wind coming down wide and clean with room enough in it, just as the letter had promised, for 2. The letter from Ohio sat on the kitchen table between them for 2 days, like a third party in the room. Neither of them moved it. Eliza went about her work and felt it there, a small white rectangle of a door standing open behind her, and she could not tell anymore whether the draught she felt was the cold front room or the pull of the easy, familiar life it offered, the life where she would be safe and known and slowly, comfortably, disappear. What she had said to him in the barn was the truest thing she had ever said to a man, and it had cost her the way the truth costs, all at once and more than you budgeted. She had been the one to start every conversation in that house for months, and she had meant it when she said she was tired of it. But underneath the tiredness was the thing she had not said, which was that she started the conversations because she could not bear the thought of a single evening passing without his voice in it. When he finally turned around and set down his careful quiet and told her about falling for the woman on the page, Eliza felt the crooked picture of her life swing slowly back toward level. Not the life she had boarded the train for. A stranger one, built out of a dead man's plans and a living man's reluctance, and her own stubborn refusal to go back with nothing. But level, hers. That's a start, she had said, and she had meant. It is more than a start. It is the whole of it. But a woman who has come this far is allowed to make a man work for the rest.